Hello, Matt is here. Today I'll be focusing on nasal cavity, part of the anatomy of intubation, and 4 objectives of Unit 2. So nasal cavity has several borders and it communicates with numerous structures that surround it. Starting with the superior border, here shown in red arrows, we have the nasal bone, frontal bone, cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, and body of sphenoid. Laterally, we have the maxilla, ethmoid bone, palatine, medial pterygoid plate of sphenoid, inferior nasal concha, and the lacrimal bone in green. Inferiorly, we have the palatine process of the maxilla and horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Posteriorly, we have the nasal choana, which communicates with nasopharynx. Anteriorly, we have the external nose and the septum of the nose, which consists of perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, vomer bone, and the septal cartilage. In terms of communications of nasal cavity, superiorly we have the frontal sinus, sphenoid sinus, anterior cranial fossa, and the frontal lobe of the brain. Inferiorly, we have the palate and oral cavity. Medially, other half of the nasal cavity, and laterally, we have maxillary sinus, ethmoid sinuses, orbit, and the pterygopalatine fossa. So we have structures in the nose called concha and meatus. We have 3 pairs of each. So the nasal concha, we have a pair of superior, a pair of middle, and a pair of inferior concha. They're fragile bones that arise from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity and are covered by mucous membrane. The superior and middle concha are extensions of the ethmoid bone. However, the inferior concha, which is the largest of all, is a separate bone, and it articulates with ethmoid, lacrimal, maxilla, and palatine bone. Then we have the nasal meatuses that are spaces between the concha. We have the superior meatus, which is below the superior concha, drains the posterior ethmoid sinus. We have the middle meatus that is located below the middle concha, drains the anterior and middle ethmoid sinuses, frontal sinus, and the maxillary sinus that opens into the floor of the semilunar hiatus in this area. And below the inferior concha, we have the inferior meatus that drains the nasolacrimal duct. Here we can see nasolacrimal gland communicates with the lacrimal gland communicates with the lacrimal sac, drains through the nasolacrimal duct, and opens into the inferior meatus. That's where it drains. In terms of the arterial supply of nasal cavity, we have 3 major arteries: ophthalmic, which is a branch of internal carotid, maxillary, and facial arteries, which are branches of external carotid artery. So starting with ophthalmic artery, it enters the orbit through the optic foramen and gives off 2 branches: an anterior ethmoid artery, which descends through the anterior ethmoidal foramen, supplies the lateral wall of the nose and the nasal septum, and gives off its terminal branch, the external nasal branch, that supplies blood to the external nose. Then we have the posterior ethmoid artery, again coming from ophthalmic artery, descends through the posterior ethmoidal foramen, supplies posterior area of the lateral wall of the nose in the area of superior nasal concha. It also supplies the posterior superior portion of the nasal septum. Then we have the maxillary artery, which gives off the following branches. First is the sphenopalatine artery that enters the nasal cavity via the sphenopalatine foramen, branches into posterior superior lateral nasal artery and posterior superior medial nasal artery. The lateral one supplies the lateral wall the nasal concha, and the mucous membranes. The medial nasal branch traverses anteriorly along the septum, descends into the incisive canal, and goes to the hard palate. We also have descending palatine artery of the maxillary artery that descends through the palatine foramen and splits into two branches, greater palatine and lesser palatine, as shown here, that supplies the blood to the hard and the soft palate. Then we have the facial artery of the external carotid artery. It has the septal branch that is itself a branch of superior labial branch, and it provides the blood supply to the anterior part of the nasal septum. This area circled in yellow in the photo is area of major anastomosis of several arteries, and the area most susceptible to epistaxis or nosebleeds. In terms of the venous supply and drainage, we have a well-developed cavernous plexus that lies beneath the mucous membrane of the nose. We have the sphenopalatine vein that drains the blood from posterior portion of this venous plexus, passes through the sphenopalatine foramen, goes to the pterygoid plexus, and eventually to retromandibular vein. Then we have the ethmoidal veins, the anterior and the posterior ones, that drain the blood from anterior and posterior portion of the venous plexus of the nasal cavity. And they follow the ethmoidal arteries, eventually drain into the facial and ophthalmic veins. And we also have the emissary veins that drain blood from the cavernous plexus of the nasal cavity through foramen cecum and eventually drain into the superior sagittal sinus in the cranial fossa. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.